All right, so we're here, Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Moses. We talked about him kind of in some detail, a little bit of detail Sunday. We'll get a little bit of detail now, and then we'll finish up this section. But we're moving through, obviously, this application part, and you have these different descriptions of by faith. But I want us to go ahead and read here verse 23 down through chapter 12 and verse 3. But one thing I want to mention to you of something to look for, and as we've gone through this whole section, did you notice how many of these different people are connected with either the land or the Exodus, or it's all before the people actually settled in the land, except for a little bit of references afterward. But all of the main discussions have that in mind, which again, a lot of that makes sense based off of his argument back in chapters 3 and 4 about the rest before us and people that ultimately behaved in a way looking for that. So, if they would, verse 23 down through chapter 12 and verse 3.
By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of sin, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing he persevered because he saw and approved of it. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the wall of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? Do I not have time to tell? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women reduced back to the dead, raised to life. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced fears, flogging, and even prison. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about sheepskin, goatskin, and sheepskin, persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts, mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart.
All right, thanks. Okay, so as I mentioned, this one really picks up the Exodus story and the entrance into the land and those kind of ideas. But one thing that I wanted to mention, and it actually is referred to right here at the end of verse 3 in chapter 12, is that if you broke this entire category, if you broke this into some big categories of what the Hebrew writer is trying to instill in his audience and what he's trying to achieve, it would be the courage, right? You can see so much of this is courage, and then the other part of this is endurance. This, when you look down at this section in 32 down through about verse 38, the whole first section is about people that didn't really have much faith, just through their little bit of faith and they're trusting God, doing amazing things, extraordinary things. And then the whole next section is where the entire scene turns. And it's like they're getting chased, they're getting beaten, they're getting enslaved and even killed. And so what they need in those instances is ultimately endurance. And so that's kind of what the idea is here when he talks about not growing weary or faint-hearted, is that you've got this ability to overcome and this strength, but then also you've got a courage or an endurance. And so they're kind of linked together throughout this section. And then the word repeated over and over, I'll tell you one of them before I get yours, is the idea of endurance. Endurance is mentioned multiple times. So let's kind of overview this section, and then we'll walk through it, and then we'll make some applications here. So what are some things that are interesting to you as you look through this section? Yeah, and how much of that reproach of Christ did he know? Barely he knew enough, but it is interesting to see, bearing this was more wealth than all the treasures of Egypt. Yeah, that's good.
To me, it's encouraging to see like murderers, prostitutes, like all the
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I was thinking about the list down here of people that he wanted to go on and talk about. How many of those were like, yeah, that's who I want to have a discussion about, right? Like you go back to the book of Judges, for example, and you look at Barak or Barak. Uh, he's the weakling in the story. Deborah's great. Deborah's like, hey, you can win. Everything's great. But that's not the person he refers to. He grabs like kind of the lower end of the totem pole here. Even Gideon. Gideon's that guy that has to have multiple signs and kind of gets dragged along by God. And then finally they win. And then the end of the story is kind of like, well, then they made an idol out of his ephod. It's kind of like, oh, what's going on here, And so it's not that great. Then it's like David. Of course, we're like, yeah, David's awesome, except, he had adultery and murdered one of his closest, warriors. And all of these people that you look at go straight to the point that you're talking about, Jacob. None of these are seen as like the perfection or, have any these people all have downsides as you go through and look at the list. It's not all of these people that you just get a flip, Melchizedek or Deborah or whatever the case is. What else?
Kind of juxtaposed through 33 down to the end of that paragraph where you have really awesome kind of triumphant things that they do paired with, getting mocked, flogged, gone to
Right.
the sword. Like both of those are true. They seem
Yeah.
to mutually exclude, but those are both true of the Christian.
Yeah. And even the lives of some of the people in the Old Testament, right? I mean, you could see the chains, imprisonment, mocking, flogging, as well as power to put armies to flight. What about the story of Samson? That's the story of Samson. Sometimes he does great things and he's conquering because of his faith. Other times it's, he's suffering and enduring things, and yet those things they're not opposites. And that's really important, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in application. But it's really important to have those concepts in our mind regarding what it means to live by faith. What else? Yeah. And I know, and I love that phrase. Actually, years ago, I did a sermon on this, but it's interesting to see the people that he describes is these people that have sheep and goat skins. They're destitute, they're afflicted, they're mistreated, they're wandering around in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth, and yet the world can't even compare. They're not worth The world's not worth these people. What else? Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting about this is how he says they are a great cloud of witnesses. And it is that idea. Do the people in the section actually see see anything or see, the actual person? And what I mean by that is, notice verse 27. He says, "For he endured as seeing him who is invisible," which is this strange, like, how do you see something that's invisible? But that's the whole point. And so they're witnesses of seeing God, but they're not. Um, but obviously, a good point there. What else? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the main concept, and I really like verse 40, where it's this idea that they've done it, they're already there. In a sense, they're at the finish line, and yet they haven't experienced even their fullness. They haven't experienced the completion of that, because there is this idea in God of all of us being made perfect at the same time. And so there's a completion there that even they're anticipating. Okay, well, let's walk through this a little bit here, and then we'll make some applications. So we've talked about Moses on Wednesday. Let's see, what what day is it? Today's Wednesday. We talked about it on Sunday, and about the decisions that he made. And one of the things that's so good about this section is how we see Moses doing these things in the Old Testament, but how often do we know what's going through his mind? Of why he goes out and kills the Egyptian. Why does he not stay in Pharaoh's house? Why does he go out to the people? And you see a lot of these same ideas. Or why did the parents go through and save the child? It's because there was something special about him. And further, when they hear about the king's edict, twice it mentions here that they weren't afraid. They know what the king said, and they're not afraid. And that's again going to what we were talking about, is this idea of not it's presently in front of you, and also enduring a difficulty that's going forward. But you have these same kind of contrasts of not only putting away the sins, but also, again, laying aside the weights that would slow us down. And we see this there in Moses' life, where, like in verse 24, you have him, he'd rather be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. And then notice in 26, again, this is kind of one of the main concepts here, but it says that he considered. What is he considering as you look through that section? And I guess, what is he considering? Then I want us to get into kind of how how do we do it as well. But what is he thinking about? Sure. Yeah. Yeah, looking forward, because it is easy to get just tied up in the moment, and especially when things are hard, when you're suffering, or even when you're really enjoying yourself, right? I mean, both of those things become part of the problem, and you see that even there in Moses's life. But what else? What else is he considering? Just as you kind of look through that section. Yeah, so I mean, one of the as you mentioned, that thinking about Christ concept, it makes you just remember that these are special people that had held on to the stories that are there in Genesis. He's not writing something different. And whenever his parents are going through and teaching him about their identity and everything, I mean, do you think they would have mentioned something like the promises to Judah, the promises to Abraham, the story in the garden about the serpent and about the one that would come and crush the serpent? I mean, these need. I mean, if they're not going to have those stories, what stories are they going to have, right? And so these are the things that Moses himself is going to write down, and obviously is part of him understanding the story of where things are going in the world. And then that goes to this concept about God. When you see verse 27, he left Egypt. Again, here's that not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured. And here's who he was seeing. In this case, he's not just kind of looking forward to better reward or anything like that. Who does he see in verse 27? Yeah, the true. It's amazing to see just a couple of things there. One is obviously, when did God actually appear in the Exodus? I mean, he's invisible through the entire thing, and he's speaking representatively through Moses and Aaron. So you have those ideas. Go ahead. Yeah, but not to Pharaoh per se. But you are right. You are right. Going to be there's I guess obviously this is at a certain point, because at some point he's going to see the back of God and that sort of. But still, it's knows God is there, even though he can't actually see him with his physical eyes. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Well, and you mentioned process, and that's one of the things I was thinking about. You look at Moses' story, how full of faith does he seem? I mean, just go back and look at it and read it. I mean, he's like, I can't even speak. I've got to get Aaron to do this. Aaron's doing a lot of it at the very beginning. Then it eventually is where Moses becomes more and more comfortable, stronger and stronger through that process. And I think when you look at these descriptions, remember, this is in hindsight, where you can look back and see where he was at the end. But again, so much of this, again, is this growth process of where these people have faith, and then there's these victories that they have over time, and their faith grows. Go ahead. Right.
And so I like that's the thing for us is like we share coworkers or friends or neighbors will reject us. And that's okay, it's a natural fear to be scared of, but it's our fear of God needs to be more than that. And so like in action in our lives, things may like
Yeah.
also be a person of faith by doing what God wants ahead of anything else that's scary.
Yeah. So I mean, there's obviously lots of things that we're scared of, but I like what he's saying. How did he do it? Here's how he did it. He kept looking at him who was invisible. And that's the things that when we're looking at God rightly, all the other fears start going down. Go ahead.
I understand what you're saying. I think one thing you have to take with God
Yeah, there's a lot. Of course, without spoiling everything for what I'm planning on talking about next week, I just was reading in Matthew 17 about the faith as of a mustard seed. I mean, that's where a lot of these people are. It's not that they just had this enormous faith, but it's that even that little bit of faith in the right place is where they're able then to do this. Because none of this is, Moses, where he just, assembled an army and was really charismatic and, whipped up the army and they were victorious through his, means of intelligence. It's never that way with any of these people. It's great that they overcame, but it's not so much just, oh, okay, their faith just made it all right. It was their faith in the power of God that made it so important. Let's move on down here to the ones that came. Verse 29, they cross through the Red Sea. They have the walls of Jericho fall. And here's Rahab as well. She's with those that are not killed because she gives a friendly welcome. So what do you think is his point of telling these particular stories? Because I mean, these are sort of, I mean, they're important, sure, but they seem like a little bit of, I don't know, maybe not a deviation. But when you look at the people he's talked about before, where you've got, here's Abraham, here's Isaac, here's Jacob, here's Joseph, here's Moses, and then we have the people in Rahab. What do you think his point with these people are, or is? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. 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 I think it's easy to sort of miss some of that because there's some of these. But if you look at some of these, when people cross the sea on dry land, that's the normal Joe. That's you and me, right? That's the people that don't believe God, and because of that, they were the ones that overcame. Same way with the walls of Jericho as well. Well, what else do you think is interesting about that section, or why he's using those? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those are really good thoughts of just like, again, kind of bringing it down to a little maybe more manageable. But then again, as I emphasized earlier, these are connected to the land promise. All of these stories are. It's about crossing the Red Sea, obviously coming out in the Exodus, but then you've got the walls there, and then the individual with Rahab. But if you go back and read those stories again, I mean, it's the story of Jericho is really, really striking. I mean, what would we gain from just walking around an enormous city? We wouldn't gain anything. except for the fact that we walk and we do all these things, and we do it the way God said it. And because we had faith and we did that, then that's where the power is coming. And the point with Rahab, if you remember, she already understands who God is. She put together the thoughts about the Exodus and said, hey, like, we know that God's with you and that He's given over the land. And she's like raising the white flag where the Canaanites are sticking their heels in the ground. And it's just about a totally different mentality. And then ultimately, she becomes part of this line and receives the blessings that go with it. But let's talk about this section here in 32 down through verse 40 in the sense of this kind of summary section here. And as I mentioned, I think he breaks it into two like general categories. And we talked about the people that he references here, and how in many ways these are kind of like Austin was talking about. These are the people that maybe they're not the rock stars. I guess you would know these people, but sometimes, I mean, these are struggling people in a lot of ways. I mean, just the idea of Jephthah being in there, Samson, Gideon, Barak, but yet all of them go to his primary point about how were they successful, how did they overcome, and what were they able to do, and it's all because of faith. It's because of what God is doing, and then that process of growing. But you see that there in 33 down through 35, here's just kind of this shotgun almost of conquering kingdoms, enforcing justice, obtaining promises. Down there in verse 35, women receiving back their dead by resurrection. The transition there toward these people that endure. What do you think is the point of referencing all of these different details, all of these different perspectives, as he's trying to prove that to his audience? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it goes to, again, one of those words he's been using is that word consider. They've gone through, they're thinking through this, and you can even see that in the story of Gideon. I mean, to his credit, I mean, eventually he goes and he's winning, but he's going through this whole process of like, okay, fleece, wet, okay, fleece dry, going back and forth. But you can imagine what that would be like. He's trying to kind of reason through this whole process. And eventually, he's gathering the armies, and there's these guys down in the camp that are like, oh yeah, this is Gideon. Here's, this whole destruction, and this is going to be it. He's like, okay, he gets it, and then he wins, right? But it tells us, I think, something about how to read the Old Testament and how to read the Bible, because a lot of times we have this burden to be perfect. Our failures are somehow going to prevent us from being, what God wants us to be. And true, these are obviously flawed people, but the idea is their faith, and their faith being built is going to change them into being able to do these kind of things. Because I think my favorite phrase here that I think summarizes up a lot of this is we're made strong out of weakness. That's where they were. That's where God began with them. And then yet God had a process that worked through that. But what else do you think is part of his reason for, giving this smattering of all these different things? Go ahead.
Subjugated people, that's the word with them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having to put all of my trust in what was obviously, from a human standpoint, the wrong part to bet on, right?
Sure.
I'm betting on the right people,
Yeah.
God's people. If I'm betting on the wall to fall down to walk around the best time, I'm not really sure that under normal circumstances that would be, I'm putting all of my eggs on that.
Sure.
Rahab, I'm behind you fall, but yet she risks her life to save his life, lets him go on this trust that, hey, we're all going to fall down, I'm going to be safe.
Yeah.
If you try to look at, these other examples, facing armies much larger than the armies they're facing, warriors, facing surface with stone, I'm wandering in the wilderness if we're taking my life. I'm going to go face these flames, but trust that God is better than
Yeah.
even talking to the fire burn. An example of like I'm looking in the face of what he was really moving to do from an earthly standpoint, but I trust God, even though this suffering looks this is not the right way to go. From a human perspective, I don't trust God.
Yeah, it's interesting to see kind of the contrast that if they use their reasoning according to the world, this is a bad decision. But if they reason according to seeing him who is invisible, looking to that reward, then the answer's logical. And I think part of the reason that he goes through and shows all of these different things is I'm thinking about different moments, doesn't it? It's not always going to fires are that you're escaping the edge of the sword. Sometimes it's the strength coming out of weakness. It's enforcing justice, even though it doesn't look very just at the moment. But it all is based in that same kind of picture. Go ahead.
As people who are enduring or going looking forward to enduring persecution, who in their mind may be conception about what life is like while still on earth.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of puts this together that I think makes kind of say it's always been this way with God, that you have and that not make what you're experiencing now does not make the truth of Christ wrong or anything like that. That doesn't make this something to reject now. And the truth past, true now. Like God is going to right all things.
Yeah, and both of these categories, whether you're on the winning side or the losing side, they can even happen to the same person. I mean, you read the prophets, you read the Old Testament. Some days it's going great, other days you're running away. But yet that doesn't mean that you've lost. But there's a couple of things that are important here that they obviously have in their mind. Notice verse 35. Verse 30, 35, the end of it, so that they might rise again to a better life. Like it's the resurrection of, having this better life that's ahead of them. You see that even down there, Emily made this point earlier, verse 40, of providing something better for us. That when they're thinking about even the life that they have now, it's very much like Abraham was kind of working through, okay, I can lose my life. I may win in this moment. I may lose in this moment, whatever the case is, but I know God is faithful in the resurrection. And the resurrection is going to be that balance to make all things new, right all wrongs, those kind of ideas. But what else do you think is his point or that we need to gain from the end of this section down through verse 40? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that's verse 1, right? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It is a confidence. God wants us to be confident. But again, this whole section is not saying, okay, be confident in yourselves. It's be confident in God. And once you get that right, then the rest of it just starts clicking a little bit. Because sometimes it goes great and sometimes it doesn't. But when we look at all of these, kind of put it all together, let's look down here at this last section and then we'll work through some applications. So he's saying here's this great cloud of witnesses. And so when we see that, here's the logical practical things. We lay aside every weight. Now, these weights are things that in of themselves are not sinful because of the very next phrase and what he talks about, but they're things that are simply just they're slowing us down. Then you have sin to us, and then here's that running with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. And so again, all of these people, we see how great they are, but they're just helping us to understand how great Jesus is. Jesus is greater than all of these people. And how do we know that? Look at what he says as he goes on. It's the joy that was set before him that goes back to these pleasures, the reward. He's enduring the cross. He's despising the shame and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. That's the going back to Psalm 110. And so he's got this whole mentality um, that is from Psalm 110 that is rooted in, yes, okay, I have a purpose. I may suffer, I may die, I may be victorious at certain moments, but yet I'm looking for this ruling and reigning concept and this ultimate victory. So when we look at these concepts, let's we've got just a few minutes here, and let's talk about the application. I know he kind of makes the applications there, and you could even say verse 3 fits into that as well. But we love this section, don't we? I mean, this is the section everybody loves to go to, and you love to hear sermons from it. I mean, it's like, every probably 7 years, this is a focus, right? It's one of those things. But why do we love this section? Like, why is this so helpful?
We all talk about all the time, but that was looking back, that's the evidence of how the people of God have always been treated.
Hmm.
But then, and now like what's the emphasis towards us now we consider him, and now that like now we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let's keep running the race. And so it is taking everything that the book has been up and all these arguments and saying what we need to do about it, and that kind of clarity is super nice.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
yeah, sorry, that's
Yeah.
it.
Well, and one thing, kind of going to what you're talking about, or at least I was thinking about it, is you got timestamps, right? It's like, look at all of this information you have in the past, look what's ahead of you in the future. And once you get both of those right, the present just makes sense. Like, you know what you're supposed to do. The weight's got to go, the sins have to go, and you've got to have this endurance and this vision going forward. Go ahead.
I'm kind of struck about who I choose to share the gospel with that kid.
Sure.
Yeah, Rahab the prostitute, obviously, but when you grow up and read the story of Samson, you don't walk away thinking I want my son to be like that.
Please no.
You got the rejected child of a prostitute.
Yeah. Oh.
All it's reminding me so heavily that these are the people that God used. God uses people in their love. Even take Moses. He's all gung ho about delivering the people, and God says, "No, you're not ready
Right. No, that's a good observation.
Everybody loves underdogs.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, like we look at this list in a lot of ways that they think their death and conquering and all these great obstacles in the face, and we can't relate to that a lot of times.
Yeah.
We're Christians in America,
Yeah. Yeah, think about verse 4. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. That's me, right? I mean, I haven't had to shed my blood. It's kind of like, but yet his whole point is like, you need to look at what's been happening in the past so that you're different now. So, anyway, I kind of jumped on your bandwagon. What were you going to say?
not really after like chapter 12. It's the best, some of the best locker room
Yeah. Yeah. Just sort of, okay, it's time to get back in the game, kind of restructure, refocus. Yeah, because there's a lot of that encouragement. And that's why I was saying when you have courage and enduring, those two things seem to be like the main focuses. And then he's trying to just he'll build them back up. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, and taking up the racing analogy, that's something that Austin does a lot. But if Austin goes out and he runs a race, he's not running over there with a 50-pound pack on his back. He's not running with his shoelaces tied. He's not doing all of those kind of things, right? It's because you wouldn't run a race if you knew what the goal was. You wouldn't have all of these extra weights on you. And yet, the reason that we get these things tied up is because we've taken our focus off of the race that we're running. You see that there in verse 1. And who we're looking at. We're looking at ourselves instead of looking to our founder and the perfecter of our faith and the people that he has laid out for us. But, one of the things that I want to end with, again with this, is just how we read the Old Testament. Because oftentimes it's like, hey, these are the heroes of faith and everything. And look, they are, but it's not because they were even great people at times. They were failures on a lot of different things, and yet they put their trust in God. They were victorious, and then to understand every one of these people, despite how great they are, they still needed Jesus, and Jesus is so much greater than all of them, and that really is the point. And we just need to write that into our minds when we're reading the Old Testament, because you can just tell the way he reads it is the way that we need to read it. So, all right, we'll stop right there. And we'll pick up on Sunday. We'll probably talk about verse 3 some more, and then we'll just march on into chapter 12. Thank you.